Most people think economic stability is boring. They imagine spreadsheets, cautious politicians, and countries that simply got lucky. But Denmark breaks that assumption in a way that still confuses economists. This is a country with some of the highest taxes on earth, some of the strongest labor unions in the world, and one of the most generous welfare systems ever built. And yet, instead of collapsing under its own weight, Denmark became one of the most competitive, innovative, and resilient economies of the modern era. That is the mystery. How did a small nation with no oil, no vast natural resources, and no imperial power manage to build an economy that repeatedly survives global shocks while larger countries stumble? The answer is not simple, and it is not comfortable. It is a story of hard choices, painful failures, and a system that looks compassionate on the surface, but is ruthless underneath. To understand the Danish model, you have to go back before it even existed, to a cold, flat land on the edge of Europe, where survival itself was once uncertain. Denmark was never destined to be rich. Its soil was poor compared to the great agricultural empires. Its population was small. Its geography made it vulnerable to larger powers. For centuries, Denmark lived with the quiet fear that one bad harvest, one war, or one trade disruption could push the country into chaos. That fear shaped everything that followed. While other nations chased glory, Denmark learned caution. While others gambled, Denmark learned to hedge. And while others built empires, Denmark learned to build systems. In the 19th century, Denmark suffered a humiliation that permanently changed its national psychology. After losing territory and power in wars against stronger neighbors, the country was forced to confront a painful truth. It could no longer rely on military strength or expansion. Economic survival would have to come from within. Farmers began organizing cooperatives, not out of ideology, but necessity. Alone, they were weak. Together, they could bargain, standardize production, and survive price shocks. This cooperative mindset quietly laid the foundation for what would later become the Danish economic model. It was not socialism. It was not capitalism as the world understood it. It was pragmatism, forged under pressure. As industrialization spread across Europe, Denmark faced another challenge. Urban factories grew, but the country feared the social unrest seen elsewhere. Strikes, revolutions, and class conflict were tearing other nations apart. Denmark made a different bet. Instead of crushing labor or surrendering to chaos, it forced capital and labor into the same room. Employers and unions negotiated nationwide agreements that traded stability for predictability. Wages rose steadily, but so did productivity. Workers gained security, but companies gained peace. This uneasy balance did not eliminate conflict, but it prevented collapse. Slowly, Denmark built trust, where other countries built walls. Then came the 20th century, and with it, the real test. The Great Depression did not spare Denmark. Exports collapsed. Unemployment surged. The system strained. Many countries responded by turning inward, erecting barriers, or embracing radical politics. Denmark chose something riskier. It expanded social protections while demanding adaptation. The state stepped in, not to freeze the economy in place, but to keep people afloat while industries adjusted. This was the first glimpse of what would later be called flexicurity, a concept that sounds soft, but is brutally demanding. Companies were allowed to fire workers easily. In exchange, workers were promised income, support, and retraining. The safety net cushioned the fall, but it did not stop the fall. That distinction mattered. After the Second World War, Europe rebuilt, and Denmark rebuilt with it. But while many countries borrowed heavily or protected inefficient industries, Denmark doubled down on coordination. The state invested in education, infrastructure, and health, not as charity, but as economic strategy. A healthy, skilled population was not a moral luxury, it was an asset. Taxes rose, and they rose deliberately. The promise was clear: pay more now, and you will not face ruin later. This social contract was fragile, and it depended entirely on trust. If citizens believed the system was corrupt or unfair, it would collapse. That threat never disappeared. It hovered constantly in the background. By the 1970s, the model faced its first real breaking point. The oil shocks hit Denmark hard. Energy prices soared. Inflation surged. Unemployment rose. Suddenly, the generous welfare system looked unsustainable. Critics warned that Denmark was drifting toward stagnation, burdened by high taxes and rigid structures. They were not entirely wrong. Growth slowed. Public finances weakened. The system that promised stability was now creating inertia. Denmark had reached a dangerous crossroads. Preserve the model and risk decline, or reform it and risk social unrest. What happened next is often misunderstood. Denmark did not abandon its welfare state. It sharpened it. Painful reforms followed. Benefits were restructured. Incentives were adjusted. Labor market rules became more flexible, not less. The message was subtle but firm. Security would be provided, but passivity would not be rewarded. Education and retraining became central pillars. Losing a job was no longer a personal failure, but staying unskilled in a changing economy became unacceptable. This shift was politically dangerous, and it required consensus across parties that often disagreed on everything else. But the fear of collapse was stronger than ideology. By the 1990s, the results began to show. Denmark entered the era of globalization not as a victim, but as a prepared participant. While factories moved and industries transformed, the workforce adapted. People changed jobs frequently, but rarely fell into long-term despair. Businesses innovated without fearing permanent labor unrest. The state ran surpluses instead of deficits. What looked like an expensive system turned out to be an efficient one, not because it was cheap, but because it prevented long-term damage. The Danish model was not about maximizing growth at all costs. It was about minimizing disaster. Then came the global financial crisis. Once again, the world watched economies fracture. Banks collapsed. Housing markets imploded. Unemployment exploded. Denmark was hit, but not shattered. The housing market fell, but safety nets absorbed the shock. Unemployment rose, but retraining programs activated. Public trust, though strained, held. The crisis exposed weaknesses, but it also confirmed something crucial. Stability was not the absence of pain. It was the ability to recover without tearing society apart. Of course, the story is not one of perfection. The Danish model has failed, repeatedly, in smaller ways. Integration of immigrants into the labor market proved far harder than expected. High taxes created incentives for avoidance. Some industries struggled under global competition. Reforms sometimes overshot, cutting too deeply or too quickly. Each failure forced adjustment. There was no final victory, only continuous maintenance. This is the part often left out of the myth. The Danish model works not because it is elegant, but because it is constantly revised. Today, Denmark stands as a contradiction. It is both generous and demanding. It offers security, but it expects participation. It taxes heavily, but it delivers visibly. It allows companies to move fast, but it refuses to let people fall forever. This balance is fragile. It depends on trust, social cohesion, and a shared belief that the system serves everyone, not just elites. That belief is under pressure. Globalization strains solidarity. Demographic changes test finances. Political polarization threatens consensus. The same forces that challenge every modern economy are knocking at Denmark's door. So what is the real lesson of the Danish model? The first takeaway is that stability is not free. It is paid for upfront, through taxes, discipline, and uncomfortable compromises. Countries that promise security without demanding adaptation eventually collapse under their own promises. Denmark avoided that fate by refusing to lie to its citizens. The second takeaway is that flexibility without security breeds fear, and security without flexibility breeds stagnation. The model works only because it binds the two together. Remove one, and the system breaks. The third takeaway is that trust is the most valuable economic asset of all. Once lost, no policy can replace it. The warning is simple and unsettling. The Danish model cannot be copy-pasted. It grew from history, culture, and repeated trauma. Trying to imitate it without the underlying trust risks failure. And even in Denmark, the model is not guaranteed to survive. Stability is not a destination. It is a process that can reverse if neglected. The open question is whether modern societies, fractured by mistrust and short-term thinking, are still capable of building systems that demand sacrifice today for safety tomorrow. Denmark answered yes, but only by accepting limits, facing reality, and choosing cooperation over illusion. That choice is available to others, but it is far harder than it looks. If you want more deep, story-driven explorations of how economic systems rise, fail, and reshape the world, subscribe to the channel and stay curious.